Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture, where we explore ideas, stories, and people, challenge convention, and deepen our understanding of this strange thing called counterculture. Well, today I'm recording this, July 17th. It's International Naked Day. Now, I've no idea who comes up with these things. Maybe there's some small dusty office in Buenos Aires or Ulaanbaatar where there's somebody who decides which days are going to be attributed to such things, but here it is. You'll be relieved, I suspect, to know that I am fully clothed, though, whilst recording this. But what does it mean to be naked, in body and in spirit? And why has human nudity so often been revered and feared? Sexualized or weaponised? And what might a more conscious approach to our bodies, to our collective discomfort around them, reveal about our culture and ourselves? Well, we're going to find out because my guest today is Philip Carr-Gomm, writer, psychologist, spiritual teacher, and former leader of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, one of the largest Druid organisations in the world. Philip's had an amazing career. He's written lots about spirituality and psychology in the intersection of the two. He's a psychotherapist. His books, including The Druid Way, Druid Mysteries, Seeking the Sacred, The Book of English Magic, bridge ancient wisdom and contemporary life with, I'd say, a wonderful depth and clarity. His book, A Short History of Nakedness, is a rich, wide-ranging exploration of the role that nudity has played in religion, protest, art, and performance, from the ancient world to the modern era. He takes us through everything from Christian flagellants, naked saints, contemporary nudist movements, and political activists who use nudity to make bold statements. We're going to get into all that and the difference between being naked and nude, the legend of Lady Godiva, naked counterculture, breasts, not bombs, the Naked Rambler, and even the Full Monty, the film that brought nakedness to the British public, and Calendar Girls, who did the same thing, and get Philip's tips on how to get more naked. And we're even going to mention that strange phenomenon that seems to have disappeared, for a while anyway, streaking. How does that sound? Let's do it. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture, Philip. Good to see you.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm delighted to be here.
Before we get into the subject of nakedness, in all its depth, it's very difficult to actually sum you up. So I thought, rather than me do it, I thought I'd let you do it. So my first question to you is, who is Philip Carr-Gomm?
Well, for years, I battled against the fact that I was a sort of generalist. And, the jack of all trades, master of none phrase haunted me until I found out one day the second part of that aphorism, which is better by far than master of one. And so over the years, I've come to accept the fact that I am and do lots of different things. I'm a psychologist and psychotherapist, but I've also led a Druid order for over 30 years and recently handed on the baton there. And I write books, and I'm interested in all sorts of different things, including, the topic for today, nakedness.
So you're born in London and grew up in, what we generally call sort of height of the countercultural years, the sort of 60s and 70s. And you mentioned then, of course, Druidry, and that has been a massive chunk of your life. I think it was quite intrigued to read that you came across that when you were just 11, and you can sort of tell us in a way what you became in terms of your leadership role in that, and then you handed it on, and I thought that was interesting too, to do that for so long with all it involved, and then to pass the baton on gracefully.
Well, it just makes a lot of sense. I think if you kind of, the way in your life, that your life has sort of cycles and rhythms to it, and after sort of 30 odd years of doing it, I just knew that it was time to pass the baton on. And what was extraordinary about it was that I didn't really know what I was going to do afterwards, but having handed it over, within a fortnight, my whole life changed in a way, in as much as a sort of theme from the past and from that countercultural era, psychedelics, emerged when I met Rosalind Watts, who was the clinical lead at on the Imperial College trials for using psilocybin for depression. And she kind of got me up to speed on what had happened. I'd been completely unaware of the revolution in psychiatric medicine that was happening. And she invited me to work with her. And that began a whole new phase of life that I wouldn't have predicted at all. And B, I wouldn't have got into if I hadn't let go. So, I'm glad that I did.
It's good teaching, isn't it? Sometimes you've got to let go of stuff before you can pick up something else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
In terms of your own sort of psychedelic life, as it were, or even just countercultural life, growing up in the 60s in London, in Notting Hill, which is, was one of the kind of epicenters, wasn't it, of the psychedelic sort of revolution of those times. Very posh now, of course, but what was it like growing up in that time and sort of witnessing that stuff going on around you in the late 60s and 70s? And
I wasn't aware of the fact that until much later in my 40s, and it suddenly came to me that being born in 1952 was only 7 years after the end of the Second World War. But I didn't spend my childhood thinking, gosh, the Second World War only ended 7 years ago. That wasn't at all what in my mind. And yet, looking back, there were bomb sites everywhere. As a kid, I used to watch those sort of Second World War movies. My dad had been in the army and told me all sorts of stories. And it sort of the echoes of the war were still around. There was a kind of rationing when I was a baby, and so on. My memory of it is that it was all quite gloomy in a way. Notting Hill Gate before the film was kind of pretty dreary. And in fact, Colin Jordan, who ran the British Nazi Party, across the other side of the street, they had a sort of basement full of jackboots and swastikas, and at that time, although when I was a kid, I was unaware of all that. And yet there was Portobello Road, a source of perpetual fascination with its market at the weekends and so on. But it was in the sort of late 60s, 70s that flower power came. And then the colour got switched on. And in fact, London, of course, is made up of lots of different villages, really. And so most of my friends were actually in Hampstead. So I would sort of travel to the northern realms to have my fun in Hampstead. And because this era was all about really expanding horizons and accessing different levels of consciousness, so that interest in spirituality occurred at the same time. So I was both interested in other realms of consciousness in terms of what me and all the other kids were doing, which was sort of getting high in various ways, but also in terms of spiritual development and that kind of exploration, which is why I got interested in Druidry at the same time.
It's actually not something that we haven't really covered very much on this show in terms of consciousness awakening, the impact of Eastern philosophies. Imagine the Beatles with Rajneesh and all that sort of stuff, but it was such a big part of it. And I mean, obviously a lot of people got turned onto that through psychedelics. LSD, it might have jolted them, as it were, into a different realm. But Druidry is a particularly British or Celtic thing, isn't it? And so what was it about that, or what is it about that, in fact, in terms of consciousness that appealed to you? And in fact, you spent 30 years of your life deeply immersed in it.
From one point of view, it was kind of crazy on my part because the Druids that I met all seemed to be ancient people. They were probably younger than I am now. I don't know, they were in their 50s and 60s or something. But they seemed ancient. It had the dusty, dry feeling of the sort of Victorian magical order hang over. But I was captivated by the idea of magic and the kind of romance in that. And so despite the fact that I would leave my kind of hippie friends who were all sitting around and listening to Led Zeppelin and smoking pot, I would go and sit in a room in West London with some elderly people, trying to meditate or doing a Druid ceremony or something. A part of me used to say, what am I doing? This is crazy. Why aren't I with my friends, just having fun and getting high? But there was something in it. It wasn't rational. At one level, I kind of had it in my family story because my granddad was a friend of Alfred Watkins, who developed the concept of ley lines. The old chief druid was a friend of my dad's, so he was like a sort of figure that was around a lot. He used to visit us and so on to see my parents. And then there was that book, The View Over Atlantis, that John Michel wrote, which became a kind of cult classic. He brought the idea of ley lines, feng shui and sacred geometry, numerology, and so presented this picture of this magical landscape. And so the sort of thought that we had all these magical and sacred places, Glastonbury and Stonehenge and ley lines and sacred stone circles and so on, that this was it was still here behind the sort of bomb sites and the grey industrial landscape.
And behind the tower blocks and the modernist reimagining of the city topography, right?
Yes, exactly, because Notting Hill Gate had one of the first tower blocks, this incredibly dull block bang in the middle, but which was nevertheless very striking.
Was part of it like just being able to reimagine the sacred, the magical, somehow, in the modern world of Britain, actually, in this case, to sort of reconnect with that?
I think what it was is, at one level, it wasn't rational. So, in other words, I wasn't sitting there thinking, at the age of, I started training with him when I was 16. I think what captivated me when growing up in a kind of urban culture, my parents used to drive me out to, Richmond Park, and the trees seemed so important to me. And when I met the old chief Druid, he was writing little sort of poetic pieces about the Ogham alphabet, which is the sort of what's been called the Druid tree language, which Robert Graves made famous through his book, The White Goddess. And I just found this kind of combination of poetry and tree lore, summoning the trees in this sort of magical way, just kind of turned me on, really.
Here is a sidebar about Druidry. The original Druids were part of an ancient Celtic culture that spread across Europe, especially in what we now call Ireland, Britain and parts of France. They weren't a single group, but more of a sort of social, spiritual elite, and they existed long before written records were common, so much of what we know about them comes from sources like the Romans. Julius Caesar, who encountered the Druids in Gaul, described them as philosophers, judges, religious leaders. He noted their power and influence and a dedication to an oral tradition. They didn't write down their knowledge, but memorized vast bodies of lore. Druids served many roles. They were priests, yeah, sure, but they were teachers, astronomers, healers, political advisors. They presided over rituals, some of which may have involved human sacrifice, though it's hard to separate fact from Roman propaganda. They had a deep connection with nature and the spiritual world, conducting ceremonies in oak groves near sacred springs or by standing stones. But of course the Romans didn't like competition, especially from powerful locals. So during the conquest of Britain, they targeted Druids as threats. And over time, as Christianity spread, the old Druid ways faded, at least in public. But fast forward to the 18th and 19th centuries, and something interesting happened. The Druids returned, not as priests in forests, but as symbols in art, poetry and nationalist movements. These romantic Druids, you could call them, more of a cultural revival than a religious one, inspired by ancient texts, archaeological finds and a deep yearning for pre-Christian roots. Scholars and mystics reimagined the Druid as a wise sage of a lost noble age, a bit like Gandalf. And out of this came the modern contemporary Druidry, which is alive and evolving. It's a modern spiritual path inspired by the ancient Druids, but not claiming direct lineage. Think of it more as a sort of revival than a resurrection. Modern Druids focus on nature, spirituality, reverence for the earth, celebration of the seasonal cycles. It's often grouped with modern paganism, and many Druids observe the solstices and equinoxes, celebrating festivals like Samhain and Imbolc and Beltane. Now, they may be polytheistics, animistics, agnostics, or even Christians. It's less about belief and more about practice, connecting with the natural world, honouring ancestors and living in harmony with the planet. Groups like the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, OBOD, founded in the 60s that Philip mentioned and which he was a leader of for 30 years, have helped this revival, offering teachings and a community. But Druidry remains deeply personal. There's no central dogma, no single sacred text. It encourages seekers to learn from the land, from history, and from their own experience. A Druid might be somebody leading a ritual under a full moon, somebody planting trees to restore a forest, somebody writing poetry in praise of the seasons or meditating by a river. Somebody who finds the sacred in the world around them and seeks to live with awareness of that. You've spent 30 years doing it, but also writing a lot of books and doing various other things. And I suppose that brings us to today. And in fact, International Naked Day. Both for listeners, both Philip and I are fully clothed during this conversation, at least. Although I'm going to ask Philip later about his own practice of nakedness.
There's a kind of connection between this topic and what we were talking about, in as much as I only discovered the kind of richness of this subject, the kind of energy in it and the interest in it, when I was in my early 50s. And I decided to write the biography of my Druid teacher, the one that I'd met, when I was 11, that we were talking about. And I asked the historian, Ronald Hutton, how do you write a biography of somebody that you didn't know that well? Because he was a very private man and he taught me Druidry, but he didn't talk about his private life, or anything really much. So, and Ronald Hutton said, the first thing you do when you write a biography is you go and look for their will. And you dig it up, you follow the tracks. And I got his will, and it said that he gave his chalet in Spielplatz to somebody. And I'd looked that up, and that was Britain's first utopian naturist community. And I just rang them up. I got them, got their phone number and rang them up and said, can I come and visit? And they said, no, you can't. Are you a naturist? And I said, no, and they said, well, no, you can't just turn up. So anyway, I got chatting. And in the end, I ended up on the phone to an elderly lady who had known my Druid teacher when she was a kid at this nature. And she said, come. And she invited me for lunch on the hottest day of the year. It was sort of in August, out in Hertfordshire, just near St Albans. I turned up and it was a beautiful spot with a lovely swimming pool. And I was the only clothed person in the place. And we chatted in her little chalet, and she was naked and everybody else was naked. Went out to have lunch, and I was sitting there absolutely boiling. And I looked across the lawn and I saw a granddad with his son and daughter-in-law and grandchild all having a picnic on the lawn, and everybody they were all naked. And I looked at them and I said, gosh, that looks so beautiful and so natural and normal. It's like, and I turned to my host and I said, I feel actually embarrassed being clothed, funnily enough. It feels really uncomfortable that I'm the only person clothed, you see. And they said, well, we didn't want to coerce you or embarrass you. You're free to do anything. If you want to get undressed, get undressed. And that was when I discovered that it just takes a moment. There's that moment's hesitation, that feeling of sort of strangeness and embarrassment and so on, self-consciousness really. And then suddenly it's like, oh, and I spent the afternoon and I swam in the pool, and I ended up buying a little chalet there and using it as a writer's retreat, and dived into this whole world and discovered, the political dimension of it, the spiritual dimension of it, the cultural dimension of it.
So in some ways you went from being, or imagining yourself as being nude, to being naked.
I suppose so, yeah.
And it reminds me, with my kids, there was a time, I can't remember exactly when, but there was certainly a time when they run around naked and there was no issue if they were naked or I was naked. But there was a time suddenly when, like Adam and Eve, they became aware that they were nude. Yes. Very much connected with the development of adolescence and puberty and all that sort of stuff, of course.
Absolutely.
And there is, of course, I was going to say there is something necessary about that, but there's also something rather sad about it at the same time. As I'm saying it was necessary, I'm thinking, well, was it necessary? I don't know. I suppose so. I think in my sort of British way, Well,
no, this is precisely, you see, why it's such an interesting subject, because it's quite complex, isn't it?
It is.
Because on the one hand, it should be really straightforward. It's like, we shouldn't be ashamed of our bodies. It's completely natural, and you can argue that it's precisely when stuff gets hidden away that you get the distortions and the problems. So, let it all hang out, as you might say. However, it's not as simple as that for all sorts of reasons, because of the association with sexuality, and also because of the complication even in that as William Blake, I think, and God has pitched his mansion in the place of excrement. So you've got this particular zone in the body that is responsible for such pleasure and for the mystery of birth and all the wonders and miracles of the human race being born. And yet at the same time, it's where we poop and pee from. which makes it kind of complicated in all sorts of ways, and the associations and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's actually, people used to say to me when I'd tell them I was writing a book about nakedness, that they'd say, well, how can you get a whole book out of that? I mean, what can you say? Well, I hope, as any reader will discover, there's actually a lot you can say about it.
Let me just read this back to you. The naked human body evokes powerful and often contradictory feelings and ideas. It can thrill or revolt us. It can signal innocence or sexual availability, honesty or madness, oneness with nature or separation from society. Advertisers and the media are aware of the complex and ambivalent associations that most of us have toward the subject and use images of bare skin or simply the word naked to compete for our attention, while mystics have used nudity to get closer to God, and political protesters have discovered that simply bearing all represents one of the most effective ways to gain publicity for their cause. In that description, it kind of covers what you cover in depth in the book, these three distinctions, or these three areas: sacred skin, the first section, the body politic, the second, and then from streakers to the naked chef, the modern world, as it were, in the third. But also in there's a very important thing, I think, because you use the word naked and you use the word nude or nudity. And let's just start with that, because there is a distinction which I'd never thought of before, which is very important in this history. I mean, I mentioned then Adam and Eve, and I suppose, you make the point, don't you, that in some ways by say our, I mean generally sort of Western Judeo-Christian visions of what nakedness means kind of does stem from that, doesn't it? There's Adam and Eve sort of rolling around, enjoying themselves quite innocently, as it were, until Eve takes the apple from the servant and they eat it, and then suddenly they're aware of what? That they're naked. Or you could even say that they're nude, because I think you quote John Berger, I think, who's said that the difference is that nakedness, when observed, becomes nudity. In this case, they're suddenly aware that they're being observed by God, right? The Judeo-Christian, judgmental, disapproving God, right?
Exactly. And if you take that sort of story and you translate it into your account of, your kids' development, which is absolutely what happens with children, it's almost as if, that lovely, when kids are toddlers and I've my grandchildren now, they're also, toddling around in the garden naked and all the rest of it. And there's an innocence in it because they're not, I was going to say they're not aware that they're being observed. Of course, they do know that they're being observed, but it's not an issue for them, the fact that you're looking at them. And it's when, with the advent of puberty, when suddenly they become really conscious of the fact that they are being observed and they are naked. So there's a funny way in which that story resonates in our own individual sort of psychological development.
Well, with toddlers, you get the feeling that their consciousness is not disconnected from everybody else. They're sort of operating in some sort of field, not so much as them as separate beings so much, that they're connected, particularly with their parents, right?
Exactly. And then it's as you get older, you realize you are a separate being. And then at a certain moment, you become very self-conscious.
Given all that, given the biblical story and given the thing that we've inherited in the Western culture, and that's obviously shaped our attitudes, against that you posit the classical culture, and I'm speaking to you from Epidavros, from not far from the Temple of Asclepius in Greece, and of course a very different attitude towards the naked body, quite often one which was, well, at least admiring, celebratory, sensual, right? I mean, we look at classical statues, and it's not just the nymphs and the gods, although they're often shown naked, but it's the heroes as well, right?
Yeah, and in fact, it's an Apsley House, down by Marble Arch, where you get Duke of Wellington, who had a statue of, I think it was Napoleon naked. Of course, to our mind now, it's absurd. Can you imagine a statue of, I don't know, Boris Johnson or Winston
please,
naked?
Please. But in the classical world, this was something which was, I suppose in a way, very much more connected with what you were talking about earlier, which is very much connected with nature and something to be celebrated, right? In the first section of the book, which sacred skin, as you could call it, you say stripping off has been a shortcut to transcendence. So interestingly, with it, Saint Francis, obviously Christian, renouncing property. Digambara monks demonstrating non-attachment, or modern Druids greeting the solstice. The sky-clad Jain monks, medieval Christian ascetics, the fools for Christ of Russian Orthodoxy, and the tantric practitioners. So for them, actually, taking the clothes off, exposing yourself, as it were, to the world, to nature, to the universe, to God, I suppose, in a sense, was actually part of their practice, right?
Really interesting Jain practice. It's split into two groups, the sky-clad group, where the monks are naked, and then there's the Shvetambaras who are clothed in white robes. Amongst the lay followers in the Jain religion, one of the practices can be that for 45 minutes every day, you take your clothes off and you sit and you meditate and you do prayers and so on, religious practices. And it's this idea of you renounce everything, including your clothes. You just let go of everything you can let go of. And there's something really beautiful and powerful in that, I think. When it's used for religious purposes, it's used for an actual embodied act of standing naked before God, if you like. And one of the interesting things I found in my research was that Christianity is one of the most naked-friendly religions. Because, of course, there's this whole concept in Christianity of, man was created in the image of God. So they can't despise the image of God because that is the image of man. I've got wonderful photographs of sort of Christian ceremonies being conducted in the nude at naturist resorts in the 1930s and all the rest of it. Pastors standing there with just a Bible and nothing else. Nakedness has been used as a device in religious practice. Probably the image we're most familiar with is of the Kumbh Mela in India, where you have those hundreds of naked sadhus sort of running to jump into the Ganges. It's kind of not as you'd suspect. Of course, there is a lot of body shame and kind of repression of nakedness, particularly in the Abrahamic religions, in Islam and so on. But it's not all about that.
It's obvious, isn't it, with certain of the Islamic sect, women in particular, are entirely covered up. It's kind of the opposite, the most opposite you can get to being naked. So it's interesting that even in the kind of Christian tradition, you've got both things going on. You've got the body shaming and the sort of, maybe what we associate more with the kind of Victorian, the kind of buttoned up, where you've got to cover up the legs of the table because they're in some way indecent, versus like St. Francis and, renouncing everything. There's a sort of vulnerability about that as well, isn't there? That you're actually brave enough somehow to be vulnerable, particularly in the early Christian era or in the medieval times, because, walking around naked was exposed you to quite a bit of risk. I mean, not necessarily from public shame, but I mean, just from other things,
Absolutely. There's some wonderful mystic poetry by a lady in the Kashmir region called Layla, who used to write about nakedness, used to walk around naked and was sort of teased by the children in the village. But she wrote this wonderful poetry like Rumi or Hafiz, about the beauty of that. And that vulnerability that I think a lot of people who haven't really thought about it too much think of being naked, as showing off, people strutting about being naked. And of course you can get that in flashes and so on. But basically, when you take your clothes off, you do feel vulnerable. You are literally more vulnerable. And you do feel sort of psychologically more vulnerable too. It's not something that is done generally to assume dominance or to show off. There's something strangely humbling about nakedness if you experience it, particularly sort of in the natural world. I mean, I remember going on a hike in New Zealand and coming to this river that had flooded, and I just hadn't expected it. And I had to take my clothes off to swim across the river, sort of holding my clothes above my head. When I got to the other side of the river, I thought, well, I haven't got a towel to dry myself. I'll just have to wait a bit. And then I thought, well, there's absolutely nobody here. Why don't I just keep walking and put my clothes in the backpack, carry it in the backpack on my back? And luckily that particular trail was really soft on the feet. I didn't need to wear boots or anything. And I hiked naked through the forest, and it was the most magical feeling. But that vulnerability that you feel, it kind of translates into why it's such a powerful gesture in the political sphere. Right. Like in the second part of the book, I look at the sort of politics of it. And it's been used in protest movements, throughout the centuries.
Well, this is fascinating, isn't it? Because, I mean, you've got in terms of the bravery of doing that, because actually this is a more vulnerable position, isn't it? If you're protesting quite often, nudity also shouts. So, suffragettes, anti-war campaigners, environmentalists, they've all deployed nakedness as this moral megaphone, right? And it goes back to this story, which I think most of us had heard of but didn't quite fully understand, which is the story of Lady Godiva. Maybe you could just sort of tell us that, what happened there and what that's about.
We'll never know if it's true, but the story is that Lady Godiva husband was, I've forgotten what role he had, but he was putting up the taxes of the poor people, and she felt very much on the side of the poor people. She told him it was unfair, and she said, if you put their taxes up, I shall ride naked through the streets of the town. And he ignored her admonitions and put the taxes up. And so she rode naked through the town, and out of respect, the townspeople closed their shutters and didn't look out of the windows except Peeping Tom, which is where the Peeping Tom idea came from. Although that's probably apocryphal, we find gradually, particularly in the more modern era, naked protest being used. I mean, one of the powerful ones was breasts, not bombs. It might have been around the time of the Vietnam War. But women, bared their breasts and then held up posters saying breasts, not bombs. You all came from us. We, stop bombing people. When you look at the religious spheres, generally the males, apart from that one example of the Kashmiri mystic Layla, it was generally males who promoted the idea of nakedness for spiritual reasons. It's when you move into the political arena, it's generally women who promote the idea of using nakedness for political ends. And I managed to find the only protest in the Muslim world that I could locate, or rather the only protest using Arabic by a lady who protested in New York City in a fountain where she took her clothes off. She was an artist, and she had written in Arabic on her bottom and on her breasts, peace, not war. Unfortunately, she was arrested very quickly, but I managed to get in contact with her, and she allowed me to use photographs of her protest in the book.
I mean, you talk about, is it Femin, this Ukrainian feminist activist group, with this topless protest against various forms of patriarchy and sexual exploitation, dictatorship, religious institutions. I mean, again, it's interesting you say that it's actually women doing it, isn't it, largely?
Yeah.
From Lady Godiva right the way through to Femin. And this sort of, in a way, bleeds over into, the story of the counterculture, because, what do we think of often when we think about nakedness in the counterculture? We think about John and Yoko, don't you?
Yeah.
And, I suppose from this distance, maybe it's difficult to appreciate how rad that was at the time. And I mean, you witnessed it. So was it rad? I mean, did it feel like that when it was happening, when John and Yoko were doing that whole nakedness thing? Well, and, peace, not war.
There's that cliche that people say, if you can remember it, you weren't there. So there is some of that effect going on there for me, because you sort of live through something and you're not stepping back and analyzing it. If I look back, I mean, it was a fantastic time to be alive. I remember the bed-in, the famous bed-in that they did and so on. If you step back and you look at what happened, it's really very interesting, I think, because that photograph of John Lennon naked, curled up with Yoko Ono, that one where she's clothed and then he's in a sort of fetal position, nude, naked. Very powerful photo, pretty extraordinary. The way I look at it is that you had, flower power, the counterculture, the ideals of freedom, shaking off the chains. Let's take our clothes off. It's a quick way to change your consciousness. I had a journalist from the Times who rang me up saying, nakedness it's not a big deal anymore, is it? So I said to her, are you calling from the office right now? There are other people in the room. She said, yes. So I said, okay, if it's not a big deal, why don't you try to take your clothes off now and we'll carry on the conversation naked? And she said, well, of course I can't do that. I said, well, there you go. It's a big deal. If you want to change your consciousness, take your clothes off. Take all your clothes off now. And things will happen. Your awareness will change radically, very fast. Things will definitely happen, and your mindset will change, and all sorts of things. So all of that happened in the 60s and 70s. So you had mass streak-ins at campuses. You had, Woodstock and people taking their clothes off at pop festivals and all the rest of it. It's like, hooray, we're free.
And also images, in independent press, in the free press, in international times, starting to show more pictures of naked people. I mean, I suppose along with that, you've got the pill, sort of sexual revolution and women's liberation, the women's movement growing as well, haven't you? So an absolutely radical shift. I mean, you do talk about the fact that, even in this sort of buttoned up
country, before that, there were sort of nudist or naturist groups, weren't there? Sort of, utopians, but they were very much seen, and very much were in a way, I suppose, like, seen as being quite culty, quite wacky, and not really to do with radical politics as such, right? But to do with something else.
Well, that was my revelation when I went to this nudist colony that it was to research my teacher's biography. I'd always thought of it as sort of possibly slightly smutty. And instead, I found here a bunch of people who just liked swimming naked and not bothering with clothes when it was warm enough and so on. And it just felt really, which is why I kind of joined the naturist movement, as it were, and bought a chalet there and so on. And a couple of things happened. Towards the end of the millennium, you had the Full Monty and Calendar Girls. And they were really important because if you think about the Full Monty, it's a story about a bunch of guys who become unemployed, and they decide to do a striptease show. And that's the story. And you can imagine a movie producer thinking, well, that doesn't make a film, really. That's a bit tacky. But in fact, it was so successful. And it managed to deal with issues of, being gay, depression, single parenthood,
Poverty,
unemployment,
a vulnerability of a different kind in a way, wasn't it? Because it's, these are people who'd been sort of left behind by the
industrial decline.
Yeah, and Thatcher policies, and that they'd been sort of forgotten. They were actually, these men had become vulnerable in a different way, hadn't they? Because they'd previously been from generations of people whose self-respect was based on the fact that they worked.
And they lost their pride. Yes, exactly. They'd lost their pride, and yet they were somehow sort of reclaiming their pride in their own bodies. And, and it was so successful. You remember Tony Blair did a thing where he queued in a labor exchange, sort of unemployment queue, and then broke into the dance with one of the actors. It was, even the Prime Minister sort of supported the film as a project. And then Calendar Girls was revolutionary too, because these were middle-aged and older women taking their clothes off, but in support of, leukemia, cancer charity. And so you had a whole sort of slew of the whole naked calendar idea came out of that. And I remember a branch of the Inland Revenue got all the staff taking their clothes off, and you had the local fire brigades would issue calendars of all the lads with their clothes off.
Yeah, with just their helmets strategically placed sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. And that was huge. So the difference was huge. It's like suddenly it's not tacky to take your clothes off. It's actually quite empowering and something to be proud of. So that was massive, I think. But what happened after that, unfortunately, is we've seen, and it's because of social media, I think, we've seen that gradually in more recent years, a prudishness has crept to do with the fact that everybody's got a phone and people have become obsessed with their images. Because the thing about nakedness is it's a great leveler, because, it's only a small percentage of people that look absolutely fabulous naked, and the rest of us kind of don't,
It is the great leveler, isn't it? And of course, it's always been this way. And your clothes, expressed something about your identity, until fairly recently, that was province of just the well-to-do, wasn't it? There was even a time in medieval times when, poor people weren't allowed to wear certain colours.
And nakedness was associated with poverty. Yeah, exactly.
And then now, of course, we live in a time, thank heavens, for many reasons, but clothes, fashion, style has become part of who we are, our identity. And by that I include, cosmetics and all the other weird and wonderful things you can do with yourself, including, I suppose, tattoos. But to take all that away in the modern age, unless you are one of those few people with the gorgeous body, has brought in this kind of new strange prudishness, isn't it? We don't want to be seen as ourselves, as it were, which might mean that we might look quite similar to everybody else, or our age is revealed, or our condition is revealed. Who we are is revealed. We've gone back to hiding, in fact, in some ways, maybe for different reasons than back in the day, but still the same thing going on, isn't it?
It is. So there's this sort of movement, this swinging to and fro. There was a swinging of sort of liberation, and then you had the coming of AIDS and then the sort of shutting down because of that. And then, the Calendar Girls and Full Monty being as this celebration of the fact that, even ordinary people, as it were, could expose themselves or just be themselves, really. And now we've got the swing back the other way. American university campuses, one of their traditions, and amongst a number of them, was to have a mass streak at the end of term or beginning of the academic year or something. And
For younger listeners, just tell us what a streak is.
a streak is where you take your clothes off and dash across out in public somewhere. So they would streak across the campus. I once met a friend, they were in sort of Wolverhampton or something like that. And one of the sort of dares they would do is, come on, I dare you to streak across the town square and, usually drunk in the middle of the night, but, take your clothes off and go for a dash. I suspect they don't happen anymore.
I remember when I was a kid and being forced to watch these seemed like interminably long test matches, was desperately hoping that a streaker would kind of pop out, because that was the sort of bit of the whole experience that was fun, right? And it was usually, I think in those days, I don't remember whether they were necessarily protesting something or carrying a sign saying, free Cuba or something. I think it was just for the hell of it, wasn't it, sometimes?
It was, exactly. It was a dare. It was for the hell of it. It was for the publicity. The reason why you don't see streaking anymore is because that they made a pact that if in live sports coverage somebody streaks, they will immediately cut to another scene. So if you're ever watching a match, I suspect it doesn't happen that much anymore, but certainly sort of 5-10 years ago, this was the case, that you would suddenly see a cut to a sort of shot of the sky, or the audience, the audience cheering, is because actually there's a streak, and they agreed to give them no publicity whatsoever.
I mean, I guess that was to sort of discourage them, but it's a great shame, I thought, to this sort of loss of British
It's
culture.
Shame. It's great entertainment. I like the reverse streaking that occurred in. There's a group in Dunedin in New Zealand where the students every year would have a naked rugby match, and then somebody clothed would streak across the pitch. So it was called reverse streaking.
I love it. I suppose that was the thing to do at the nudist colony, wouldn't it? Is the protest, protest against the quality of the cooking by wearing your clothes all day. On a sort of slightly more sad note, actually, and a somewhat serious note, fairly recently in these islands, is the story of the Naked Rambler, somebody who determinedly decided that it was his right to walk around the country completely naked. I mean, I think he's wearing a pair of boots, but repeatedly arrested and imprisoned, actually, wasn't he?
And cost the taxpayer possibly millions, certainly thousands and thousands of pounds.
Here is a sidebar about Stephen Goff, the Naked Rambler. Over the course of more than a decade, Stephen absolutely walked naked across the UK. He got arrested time and time again and spent years in prison, all because he refused to put on clothes in public. That obviously does sound eccentric, but the more you go into his story, the more complex, in a way inspiring it becomes. Stephen was born in 1959, Hampshire in England. He'd served in the Royal Marines and later worked as a lorry driver, and by all accounts lived a fairly ordinary life for a while. But in 2003 something happened. He decided to walk the length of Britain from Land's End in Cornwall to John O'Groats in Scotland completely naked. He called it a form of protest, a way to challenge what he saw as unnecessary taboos around the human body and to assert his belief in absolute personal freedom. And his goal was to normalise non-sexual nudity and live in line with his values, no matter what the cost. But that cost turned out to be pretty high. Almost immediately, he ran into trouble. He was arrested multiple times during his first naked walk, mostly under public order laws for causing alarm or distress. He was charged, fined, imprisoned, but he kept going. He actually finished that first naked walk despite being in and out of prison for much of it. His second attempt in 2005 was even more fraught. More arrests, more time behind bars. But that's where things started to take a turn from unusual to extraordinary. He refused to wear clothes anywhere, not just while walking in the countryside, but in court, in prison, even on the street outside the prison gates. And as a result, he was often re-arrested the moment he was released. I mean, there was literally stories of him walking out of a prison naked and being arrested on the spot for public nudity again. It became a cycle: arrest, court, prison, release, repeat. Each time, Stephen stood by his principles and refused to clothe himself under pressure. At one point, he spent 6 years in solitary confinement because he wouldn't wear the standard Princeton uniform or even a blanket. He was offered clothes and privileges repeatedly, but he always said no. So the big question is, why would anybody do that? Why would somebody put themselves through this much hardship just to be naked? Well, for Stephen, it wasn't about the nudity itself, it was about authenticity and freedom. He believed that wearing clothes when you don't believe in it, just because others expect it, is a kind of spiritual dishonesty. And he didn't want to play the game of social conformity. He wanted to live fully aligned with his beliefs, even if that meant being arrested over and over again. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't harming anyone, it wasn't being sexual. He just believed that the sight of a naked human body should not be considered criminal, and that if society says it is, then maybe society needs to take a hard look at itself. People were, and still are, divided about Stephen. Some saw him as a public nuisance, even a danger to children, despite the fact that he never did anything inappropriate or lewd. Others saw him as a kind of modern-day Thoreau or Gandhi, a man willing to suffer for his principles. The courts generally didn't side with him. Judges and sheriffs in Scotland acknowledged that he wasn't a threat, but still found his behaviour socially unacceptable and continued to treat his nudity as a public order offence, and he continued to serve time for it. But over time, public sympathy grew. Articles, documentaries, interviews began painting a more nuanced picture, not of a crank or exhibitionist, but of a calm, thoughtful, even gentle man who believed society was wrong about something and had the conviction to stand up to it. In recent years, Stephen has mostly stepped back from public view. After more than 10 years totally behind bars, it seems that his activism has slowed down a bit, understandably. His last known arrest for public nudity was several years ago, and he has not resumed the headline-making walks that defined his earlier protests. He's still a committed naturist, but not actively provoking the legal system. He's still living with the same values, but not as confrontationally. His legacy remains. He sparked national conversations about the criminalisation of nudity and the ethics of imprisonment for non-violent dissent, and what it really means to be free. And whether you see him as a freedom fighter, a stubborn idealist, a madman, something in between, there's no denying the Naked Rambler walked a road that few others have dared to take. And he did it without a stitch of clothing.
Quite absurd. They should have just left him alone. It became an obsession for him, and it almost seemed to become an obsession for the judges to punish him for defying them. It looked to me, when I was catching up on it a while back, that it was this crazy battle of defiance, and
And yet when people do it en masse, in London, the naked bike ride, nobody's going to imprison all those people. Of course, and everybody loves it. That's the strange thing, right? Even the police love it. They're not interested in stopping it, right?
Exactly. That's one of the funny things about nakedness as well, is that it can be very funny. It's like like the streamers on the football pitch. There's something inherently silly about nakedness, something beautiful about nakedness, something provocative. It can be stimulating or it can be revolting, but it can also just be plain funny.
But there is a sort of dark side to it too, which I thought would be just worth mentioning, because of course we have also the historical images, don't we, where people who have been imprisoned en masse are stripped. Maybe their heads are shaved, to sort of an attempt to reduce their individuality, actually, and to reduce their humanity as well. So this is where nakedness is used as a form of terror, a form of repression and punishment.
There's some of those photos from the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, where American soldiers were making Muslim men be naked in prison, and then photographing them and humiliating them and so on. And then the shaving of the heads, that is what happened with women who were believed to be collaborators with the Germans after the Second World War in France. And so they were stripped in public and had their heads shaved, and they were shamed in that way. So there's this use of shame. The nakedness, we come back to the story of Adam and Eve and this whole question of shame, which is such a powerful feeling that gets somehow locked into our experience of nakedness too.
On the subject of shame, probably one of the most powerful scenes in the epic, world-dominating series Game of Thrones is when Queen Cersei is stripped naked and has to walk through the city while the citizens are shouting, "Shame, shame" at her. It's this absolute ultimate image.
Which is why I feel, quite strongly that people who work in particular ways, like, I really like the work of Spencer Tunick, the photographer, who does those mass naked images. There's a famous photograph he took of, hundreds and hundreds of people on a glacier that was melting in Switzerland. And, and he took it for Greenpeace, I think, and you see the sort of vulnerability of all these naked human bodies. And then I think that's wonderful if people are able to find ways to use their nakedness, either to just experience the freedom that exists. I mean, I went on a long walk over just up on the hills over here in the Sussex Downs, and I was on a very hot day, and I got to the top of Mount Caban, and there was nobody around, and I was just incredibly hot. And I thought, I'll just take my, I was only wearing a pair of shorts and a t-shirt or something. I thought, oh, well, and then I stopped. I thought, hang on a minute, is this illegal? I mean, and then the sort of philosophical absurdity of it sort of struck me that it would be illegal to be myself.
Yes.
I imagine somebody arresting me saying, you can't be yourself without yourself being covered. You're legal, you're only entitled to exist if you are covered up. What a strange idea.
It is very strange, isn't it? Very complex. It holds both opposites at the same time. So there is a pride in it, the pride in just being who you are. There is the shame thing you talked about. It's associated with the mad, but then also with the mystic. So it's this incredible thing, which is almost every value that it holds, it also holds its opposite.
And it's just the human body. That's all it is. It's just the human body. And yet it's so resonant in this way and contains so much meaning in it. Yeah.
We've talked about your life a bit, and we talked about Druidry and stuff. And what about Nakedness and Druidry? Is there a connection there that we can make?
Because Druidry is a spirituality that aims to deepen our sense of connection with nature, it makes sense that any practice that helps you feel more in contact with nature can be used within the sort of Druid context for understanding. And so one can engage in Druid practices. By that I mean, say, meditation, tuning to the world of nature, communing with the trees, holding sort of solstice ceremonies or whatever. One can do those naked if one is so inclined, and some people do and some people don't.
We live in an age when, through social media, which you mentioned, but also through advertising, when nakedness, in some ways, hasn't sort of lost its power, though you'd expect it to. It's still used, isn't it, and abused by advertisers and media, to grab our attention in all sorts of ways. And of course, we live in an age of, vast, expanding world of internet pornography, where the use of nakedness still doesn't seem to have blunted either the shock or the appeal of it. If you sort of think forward to the future, another 25 years, what do you think we might be feeling about nakedness then?
My sense is, we are going through a sort of prudish period. The world seems to have gone backwards in so many ways, politically and socially. And I think this would be another example of that. But these things are like pendulums, and what I would hope is there would be a swing back towards a more sort of liberated understanding. This is becoming fanciful, but I think actually it ought to be a legal obligation of politicians to only appear in the nude, and they should all be naked. And in fact, all army generals should be naked. Maybe they'd stop being so damned aggressive. If there's a sort of law in psychology which goes that, stuff in your subconscious, the stuff that you deny, the stuff that you hide, that really has the power in your life. So one of the reasons I love psychotherapy is, just as I love sort of, in a way, nakedness, is that psychotherapy is about how can you become more and more naked to yourself and in the therapy session, or just not hold anything back. Not, your shame, your pride, your, secret desires, or just let them all out, because there's something about the light of day, light of consciousness, that transforms, these things. And so sort of a fanciful idea I would have is that is that there'd be much more nakedness, so that pornography would cease to have its power. But the reality is it's much more complicated than that. And
There's something rather touching about your image when you said you went to the naturist colony and you saw the grandfather and grandmother playing with the parents and the kids. And I think that one of the things which strikes me is that we don't want to see old people naked. We're okay maybe with sort of people who look like models being naked.
yeah,
right,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But we don't want to see old people naked because, of course, it reminds us what? That actually we're going to age and we're going to die. We maybe recoil if we see like a naked old person, as though that's somehow beyond the pale and that shouldn't be seen, But what is it that's beyond the pale? What's beyond the pale is that it's reminding us of maybe how we look or are going to look anyway, and it's reminding us of the sort of corporate reality of things,
Totally, which is why I noticed when I was young that I would avoid looking at old people, even my parents, in swimming costumes, because I'd find it a bit scary. None of us wants to be wrinkly and old.
And often we're not even allowed to be naked in death, are we? I mean, of course you can be, but I mean, anybody who's usually having an open casket, for instance, they're usually clothed.
Yes, they have suits on. What a strange idea,
So he loved that suit. That was his wedding suit,
Yes.
It has to be sort of strapped in because your body's changed shape. And of course, particularly in America, and made out to look like you're sort of still alive. So,
Yes,
you're not even allowed to be nakedly yourself as you're about to pass into the afterlife or wherever it is that we go.
Whereas in contrast, there's this extraordinary process of voluntary death in the Jain religion, where if you fulfilled your obligations to your family and to society, you're sort of allowed to within this particular religion. It's a very old religion. It's a wonderful religion. Who came up with the idea of harmlessness, ahimsa, originally inspired Gandhi. Within that religion, you can fast to death. You basically stop eating and drinking in the end. But some of the Jain monks do that in public, naked. They set them as extraordinary photographs of these elderly men who meditate and just sort of wither away and then die in front of everybody. And that, again, it's like you can either look at that and say, this is bonkers, this is really awful, or there's something strangely beautiful about that. It's like watching a child being born. I mean, watching a birth can be pretty kind of messy and sort of scary. And yet, of course, it's beautiful and it's part of life. So watching somebody meditating and dying who's naked is, it's a strong statement.
Absolutely. So if a listener wanted to experiment with expanding their consciousness through nakedness, Philip, what would you recommend?
What I'd recommend is, of course, this is the perfect time of year, but it's World Nakedness Day, and it's also very hot. Certainly, where in a lot of parts of the world, certainly down the south of England now. One way to do it, of course, is if you can be outside in your garden, or preferably not Piccadilly Circus or somewhere like that, somewhere where you're not going to upset anybody, or because the law in England is that nakedness in and of itself is not illegal. That what they get you on legally is the intention to cause distress and of public disorder and upset and all this. So you can actually, being naked in public is not illegal in the United Kingdom. But is to be to be in nature, lovely sunny day as it is, outside in the garden. After we've had this chat, I'll probably go out into the garden and take my clothes off and have a little sunbathe and then come back in. If you've never done it before, you will only experience the embarrassment and the weirdness and the oddity of doing it and the sort of reluctance. Because once you've done it, you realize it's no big deal at all. So you may as well get into it, really get into this. What am I feeling now? Oh, gosh, God, this feels uncomfortable. This is strange. And then do it. And then I'm pretty sure that you're going to feel like, oh, wow, what was all the fuss about? Doesn't this feel nice? And it's like for anybody who's swum without a swimming costume, you'll say, on the one hand, of course, people say, well, why make a fuss about wanting to swim in the nude? I mean, it's like little swimming cozy doesn't harm anybody, but it keeps the peace, And on the one hand, sure, it's true, it's not. But on the other hand, it's so much nicer. Be free. That's what I'd recommend. I would imagine your listenership is made of sterner stuff, and so probably that exercise is probably easy for them. So then, of course, the thing is to, dinner tonight with your partner, as they serve the main course, just stand up and say, I'm feeling rather hot. I think, and just take all your clothes off and then sit down again and tuck into the meal and just observe their reactions.
Maybe start doing that at home, not in the restaurant, though, I'd say.
Not in the restaurant. And another one would be if you know your partner's coming back from work or coming, they're out. Take all your clothes off, and then when they come back, you're just sitting there quietly reading the paper or opening the front door in your birthday suit and just enjoy what ensues.
Well, listen, Philip, you have given us a treasure because, of course, it's a paradoxical treasure. Nakedness can be sacred or profane, empowering or commodified, but it's a terrific book, a terrific history. And I want to say thanks very much for coming and stripping off, to an extent, for the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you, Stephen. It's been a pleasure.
That is it. Thanks very much to Philip. What did you think? Are you a naturist, a secret naturist, a potential naturist, a covert naturist? I mean, I'm going to put my hands up here. I'm fully clothed virtually all the time. I find it even difficult to walk around my house naked. I don't regard that as a good thing, particularly after speaking with Philip. I think I'm just quite uptight, and maybe I should do what he suggested and experiment a bit. It's certainly been hot enough in the UK recently to do that. It's going to take me a while to walk down Shaftesbury Avenue in the buff, though, and maybe everybody's relieved to hear me say that. The story of Stephen Goff is somewhat of a tragic, somewhat of a comic, and somewhat of an inspiring one. In some ways, it kind of combined all those things that Philip was talking about. Is this person mad? Is this person mystical, enlightened in some way? An activist, a trickster, all these things combined into the naked human body. Let me know your thoughts, clothed or unclothed. What do you think? Always great to hear from people. Thanks to my recent correspondents, Roger, Palmer, Peter, Stephen and Olivier. Thanks for the suggestions. Keep them coming. BureauofLostCulture.com. I will see you, hear you, and meet you further down the road, around the bend, for more of these tales from the other side.